whether Republicans win the election without carrying North Carolina. Also, Southern Democrats tend to inoculate themselves from criticisms that they are far too left-wing. If you look at Southern governors who've been elected recently, Jimmy Carter in 1976 actually took 1/3 of the conservative vote. Bill Clinton was elected in 1992, re-elected in 1996. Both times he took the states of Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Took Georgia the first time, almost took Georgia the second time. The point being, it's very hard for conservatives to make the case that they're an out-of-touch liberal if they're from a state like that. The other one I would look for is Governor Gretchen Whitmer of the state of Michigan. Michigan's also a very critical swing state. She seems to have some support with the United Auto Workers and many labor unions. She could perhaps garner some support from that group. And then you look at the states, and you look at the United States senators. We're at a time in the United States Senate when I think it's kind of the Barack Obama precedent that the earlier you get there, the more likely you are to run for president, the more likely you are to win. Accordingly, I would look at Raphael Warnock from a swing state of Georgia. It's a very interesting background, being the pastor of the same church Martin Luther King Jr. used to be a preacher of. He's shown his electoral bona fides by winning the election last time in a very heated race. Or I would look at Mark Kelly from Arizona, another swing state senator, former astronaut, very compelling story, reminds me a lot of John Glenn. Those would be some of the ones that I think that I would look at if you're kind of looking a little bit out of the kind of the bubble of the ones you hear all the time, which is essentially the two Californians, Gavin Newsom and Vice President Harris.
Is it just too late in the game, though, right now, 4 months from Election Day, to get someone other than Kamala Harris, who has the national name recognition, to be electable?
Theoretically, I think that the fact that if you have an open convention, all that has to happen is someone has to say, I nominate candidate, and then if that person garners enough votes, they're probably not on the first ballot, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh ballot, that person essentially would have a chance. You can really nominate just about anybody. In 1880, James Garfield won the nomination. He wasn't even a candidate for president. He was there nominating somebody else, for example. He ended up winning it on the 36th ballot. So you really don't know. This is something that we really have not had in our lifetime. The last time we had anything close to this was probably in 1968 when Hubert Humphrey ended up winning the nomination at the convention, even though Eugene McCarthy had won the delegates and had won many of the primaries, in which you ended up having riots in the streets of Chicago. But Vice President Harris is certainly the preponderant front runner, and she can also keep a lot of the money that Joe Biden had as well.
And talk about next steps here for the Democratic Party. Do you see, we've seen all these fractures of people calling for Biden to step aside, but do you see the Democratic Party unifying around whoever that candidate is? Do you think that is the path forward that they'll take?
I actually do, not because they necessarily like the candidate, but because they have such disdain for Donald Trump and they want to unify towards somebody. It actually might work to be advantageous for them, specifically if they take somebody from outside of Washington, because that person changes she changes the entire playbook of Donald Trump running against the Biden administration, running against Washington. All of a sudden, this candidate can run against Washington. He can run a little bit. He can even run against the Democratic Party and talk about brain dead politics of both parties, like Bill Clinton did in 1992. But if I was really looking at it, think of it this way. This person will have had no primary challenge. And usually when a candidate has a primary challenge, think, for example, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. There was a lot of enmity between the two when Hillary Clinton ended up winning the nomination. That some Bernie people actually either stayed home, or about 10% of them actually voted for Donald Trump. This would be somebody that would have no major primary challenge and no reason for there to be a division. And that person would be able to define themselves as opposed to having the Republican Party or the media define who they are.
And we, of course, cannot ignore the fact that this is still a contest between Republican and Democrats in the end. How does Donald Trump change strategy now with this announcement? And before we know, maybe it is Kamala in the end, but in the next, days and weeks when we maybe don't have the nominee set in stone, how does the Trump campaign navigate through this?
If it is Kamala, then essentially he runs the exact same playbook. And you saw him a little bit in that speech in Grand Rapids, Michigan yesterday. He's trying to essentially run against the Biden-Harris administration. The Biden-Harris administration is relatively unpopular, job approval rating under 40%. So that's an easy playbook for him. But if it's somebody who's a governor and somebody who's from outside of Washington, he can't necessarily do that. He can try to somehow allegate that person with Joe Biden and say this person is just a carbon copy of Joe Biden. But if it's somebody who, for example, has been elected in a state like Michigan or North Carolina or Arizona or Georgia, the four candidates that were mentioned, It's very hard to make that case, and I think that he really has to kind of change his playbook. Perhaps he has to make it the candidate an affirmation of Donald Trump rather than putting demerits upon the other side.
Now, some polls have shown, actually done some kind of interesting questioning here, showing that Michelle Obama could actually beat Donald Trump if they were to be matched up. Your take on the likelihood of her name being put into the ring, and do you see her as possibly being successful against Donald Trump?
She probably has the best chance of beating Donald Trump. She's somebody who has very low negatives, very high positive, extremely popular in this country right now, and somebody who's seen as kind of above the fray, above U.S. politics, for example. She reminds me of a little bit of Colin Powell back in 1995 when Bill Clinton, it looked like, was going to run away with the re-election, and the polls were showing he would have beat Lamar Alexander, Phil Gramm, Bob Dole, Dick Cooper, everyone else who was running. But polls showed that Colin Powell, who was seen as somebody who kind of transcended partisan politics, was the only person who could beat him. And Republicans absolutely begged him, they beseeched him to run. But at the end of the day, he didn't run, and Bill Clinton ended up winning in a landslide over Bob Dole. I think Michelle Obama is probably the most formidable candidate, but I don't think necessarily would want it. And you really have to do a lot of persuading to get her to run.
Absolutely. And just into our newsroom, we hear that Biden is throwing his support behind VP Kamala Harris to lead the Democrats against Trump. Your take on that being not originally included in this letter statement, and why we're, now just getting this update as we're on the air about 25 minutes after he releases that letter?
It's very interesting that he isn't making any endorsement, because presidents, you may say, well, the president, of course, is going to endorse his vice president. This doesn't always happen. Ronald Reagan, for example, did not endorse George H.W. Bush in the primary. He didn't even endorse until closer till he actually was a presumptive nominee, and he spelled it and he said his name wrong. Lyndon Johnson did not endorse Hubert Humphrey until Hubert Humphrey won the nomination in '68. Al Gore versus George and Bill Clinton was kind of the exception in 2000. So they kind of set the precedent, but it shows that even though they had a lot of enmity against each other when they ran against each other in the primary last time around, that they have really become political allies, political friends, political coefficients. And because of that, I think that you're going to see that he endorsed her. Maybe he wants to clear the field and say to his delegates, support Vice President Harris. We don't want somebody else to kind of try to challenge her and perhaps, go into the second or third or fourth chances at the nomination in terms of ballots at the convention in Chicago.
Yeah, certainly trying to provide some clarity in a situation that has only become messier and messier over the last couple of weeks. Political analyst and author Rich Rubino, thank you so much for your insight and joining us to discuss this breaking news. I want to go back now to Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, with our correspondent Maya Rodriguez. Maya, what are you hearing? I think we're having some technical difficulties. With Maya. Rich, are you still with us? Perfect, there you are. I did have one more question for you. Will you talk a little bit about the importance of doing this in this moment now? Why do you think Biden chose today, now, to do it rather than wait for an open convention? Obviously, less time to do this, but why didn't he do this, a couple of months ago when there were already some rumblings about, is he fit enough to take office? Why do you think today was the day?
Because there was such pressure that was mounting on them. Remember, it was only a couple of weeks that Lloyd Doggett, the congressman from Austin, Texas, began this essentially cavalcade of Democrats announcing that they would not support Joe Biden. You saw eventually Senator Peter Welch, but then I think that also Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker Emeritus, told him probably that, look, we have a lot of down ballot races. It's extremely important for us to keep the House and the Senate. These candidates do not want to be on the ticket with somebody whose job approval rating is in the 30s, and every time being asked by their opponents, do you support Joe Biden? And everything, I support my party's nominee when he's not popular in their districts in the states. I thought what was really consequential, if you will, was first of all with John Tester, who represents Montana, a state that Donald Trump won by 16 points last time, right after John Tester was reelected himself. And then you had Sherrod Brown, who represents Ohio, a state that went for 8 points last time around for Donald Trump. They're in very tough re-election races, and the last thing they want is an unpopular nominee. They want somebody who's at least neutral on the stage. That doesn't necessarily mean that Vice President Harris would necessarily do any better in those states, but I think that there was really kind of panic mode, and Joe Biden kind of listened to the choir of Pelosi, Schumer, and others who were really kind of the tacticians trying to maintain the majority in the Senate and trying to upend the Republicans' very, very small majority in the United States House of Representatives. Not to mention some of the governors were up for election as well.
Now, Rich, I want to ask you, since you have such a deep knowledge of presidential history, we have you on all the time to talk about precedent. We've obviously never seen a situation like this where a candidate steps out so close to Election Day. But going back to 1968 with Lyndon Johnson, talk about the fallout in his party, and did it harm his party for that next election and down the line? And draw parallels to today. Do you think the Democratic Party overall is going to be hurt on Election Day by Joe Biden stepping out right now?
In the case of Lyndon Johnson, so what happened with Lyndon Johnson is Lyndon Johnson, he ran in New Hampshire. He actually was a write-in candidate in New Hampshire. The thought process at the beginning was he's too kind of almost New Hampshire primary was kind of beneath him. So he ran. And he ran as a write-in candidate. He ended up winning 48% of the vote. Eugene McCarthy, a relatively unknown senator from Minnesota, won 42% of the vote. But then there was a poll that came out that showed that this is in a Democratic primary that Eugene McCarthy would win by double digits over Lyndon Johnson. So Lyndon Johnson saw the handwriting on the wall and announced he wouldn't seek re-election. The other thing about Lyndon Johnson is Johnson men tended to die by the time they were 65. And Johnson knew that, and he probably would die in office. And interestingly, he actually died 2 days after what would have been his second full term. In Johnson's case, his job approval did increase, and he was seen as somewhat of a statesman. But there was still a divide in the Democratic Party. There were party regulars. Party regulars wanted somebody like Hubert Humphrey who would support Johnson's policy on Vietnam. And then there were the New Left. And the New Left supported Eugene McCarthy. These were the folks in New Hampshire, many of them hippies, that went to New Hampshire and went clean for Gene. They shaved off their facial hair. They got short haircuts, because when you're going to people working at a paper mill in Berlin, New Hampshire, and you're going around and you're saying you support this candidate, it's probably better to do it looking like them than looking like a hippie from San Francisco or New York City, for example. It worked. Eugene McCarthy almost won the New Hampshire primary. But then you had a divide between Humphrey and McCarthy. And at the convention, what today we would call the superdelegates, but they're really the party regulars at the time, voted for Hubert Humphrey. He never participated in a solitary primary that year, but Hubert Humphrey ended up winning the nomination. And what happens, and it's very interesting because that convention was Chicago, this convention in Chicago, there were riots in the streets in Grant Park. Hubert Humphrey had to go up, he had to deliver his speech to winning the nomination while police outside were arresting people. Now, interestingly, Hubert Humphrey changed his position on Vietnam. On September 30th that year in Salt Lake City, Utah, he said he would support a unilateral bombing halt as an acceptable risk for peace. And once he did that, a lot of the people that were protesting him stopped protesting him. Paul Newman appeared, who was a Eugene McCarthy person, appeared in an advertisement, started to endorse Hubert Humphrey. A lot of these people came with him. It got to the point where about a week before the election, Hubert Humphrey's doing everything he possibly can to get Eugene McCarthy to support him. Finally, Eugene McCarthy says, I have agreed to support. By the way, these two are Humphrey was once McCarthy's mentor in Minnesota. He said, I have agreed to support Vice President Humphrey for president, and I ask that my supporters suffer with me. That was his endorsement. Now, a week later, both Humphrey and his Republican candidate Nixon had about 3 hours where they would both come on television, and they would talk to the American people, and they would do a telethon. And in Humphrey's, McCarthy called up, and McCarthy was a lot more complimentary of Humphrey and gave him a more full-throated endorsement. But it was a little too late. Humphrey lost in what was really a razor-thin election that year, below 1% in terms of the popular vote. And many Democrats believe that had there not been for that chasm between Hubert Humphrey Democrats and Eugene McCarthy Democrats, that Hubert Humphrey would have landed up winning that election, one of the closest really in American history. And Hubert Humphrey was Hubert Humphrey. And I think it's very interesting about Hubert Humphrey. Usually, when the issues are going, when the issues that you focused on are being focused on, that you tend to win that race. For example, Hubert Humphrey focused on health care, he focused on civil rights. But in 1968, the major issue was the Vietnam War. Hubert Humphrey, that was not his major issue, foreign policy. And Hubert Humphrey would talk about, I am pleased as punch. And he would say that we need the politics of joy. But in 1968, with all the race riots and the division over the Great Society, the war on poverty, the Vietnam War, Americans were not looking for the politics of joy. And Hubert Humphrey ended up losing that year.
Well, as you said, a razor-thin election, and it looks like that's what we are heading towards come November. Political analyst and historian Rich Rubino, thank you so much for joining us. I want to go back now to Rehoboth Beach in Delaware with our Scripps News correspondent Maya Rodriguez. Maya, you're just down the street from where President Joe Biden is isolating right now, sick with COVID, but released this letter on a Sunday. For our viewers who are just joining us, we had breaking news this afternoon that President Joe Biden announcing he is not going to continue his bid for re-election. Maya, you're on the ground there. What's the latest?
Well, you know, Alexa, this is a very fast-moving story, but we are starting to get some reaction from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. I want to read to you a couple of the statements that we've gotten so far. One of them is from Democrat House member Brendan Boyle. He is a ranking member of the House Budget Committee. He said President Joe Biden is a patriot. He selflessly put personal ambition aside to do what he thinks is best for our country today and every day, both in dark passages and bright days. I am always proud to be one of Joe Biden's biggest supporters. We also heard from U.S. Senator John Hickenlooper, the Democrat from Colorado. He said for more than 50 years in public service, President Biden has always put the country before any personal concern or ambitions. It's just who he is. His presidency and career will be remembered alongside Roosevelt's and Johnson's for its scale, magnitude, and lasting impact on American society. More than anything, I'm thankful Joe Biden has given so much to this country over a lifetime of service. Again, on the Republican side, we are hearing from former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, right now Republican running for U.S. Senate. He says, I respect President Biden for his decades of public service. I believe he made the right decision for his family and the country. These are dangerous and unprecedented times. He should be commended for putting the country ahead of personal ambition. You keep hearing that theme in all of these statements that President Biden has put the country ahead of his own personal ambition. We have been talking to people out here at Rehoboth Beach who have honestly just came here for a day at the beach. It's a Sunday. It's the high season here. There are a lot of people. This parking lot is packed with beachgoers. But we did talk to a few of them right when this news broke, and they said the same thing, that the president, in their view, is doing the right thing for the country. These are Democrats that we spoke to, longtime Delaware residents, who said that the president is doing the right thing by not running for re-election. As to who could take his place, all kinds of names were said out here. You had Kamala Harris come up, the vice president, of course, but other people were saying Michelle Obama possibly, or even Hillary Clinton. So there is just running the wide gamut of names out here of people who they would like to see take President Biden's place at the top of the Democratic ticket. But again, this is a very fast-moving story, Alexa, and we're going to work to gather more information from you, from out here. Alexa.
Absolutely. I know we've been talking, you know, for the last few weeks since that debate performance, and the questions really starting to swirl and the dissent growing among the Republican Party. Were the people that you spoke with, you know, worried that this would spell trouble for the Democratic ticket no matter what? Were they, I know you said they felt the president made the right choice, but were people worried that this choice came too late?
We did not hear that. What I did ask them, though, is what led them to the conclusion that the president shouldn't be at the top of the ticket. And what they told me was that it was the debate performance. That pretty much solidified it for them. When they saw the president during that very shaky debate performance, believe it or not, that was last month. It feels like a year ago at this point. But they said when they saw that, they knew that that was the time for the president to no longer be at the top of the Democratic ticket. I'm being told right now that we do have some of those interviews that we did out here. Take a listen to what some of the people had to say. Well, Sally, first of all, you just heard that President Biden will be not seeking re-election at this point. What was going through your mind? What are your thoughts?
I think that at this time, it's the right thing for the Democratic Party. As a native Delawarean, he has done so much for our state and as president for our country, but now is the time to step aside.
What makes you say that?
The most recent debate and things coming to light and tensions within the party. It's time to move aside and do what's best for our country. And I think that he's put the country above himself and his needs.
What about you, Maria?
Really, exactly what Sally said. I love Joe. I think it's really cool that we have a president from our home state. I love everything he's done for us. It's fun to watch the cavalcade come down the streets and stuff like that. But I think Joe should just enjoy his years, and that's that.
Did you come to this conclusion at a certain point in time? If so, what brought you to that conclusion?
Yeah, I think like Sally said, I think it was the debate. And I think that, as he's losing support in the party, I think that's a big thing, too. Like, the goal is to win the presidency, and I don't think he's the guy to do it right now.
Who do you think should step in his place?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know who should step in. I don't know if it's Hillary, if it's Michelle Obama, if it's Kamala. Whoever it is, I think that we'll totally support them.
What about you, Sally? Do you have an idea of who you would like to see step in?
Senator from Pennsylvania. We have a couple options, and I think they all have the party's best interest at heart. And so whether it's female or male is not relevant. It's what's best for the nation and what's best for our party. And we will get there.
And I'm assuming that you're both Democrats based on what you've just told me.
Yes, correct. Absolutely. My whole life, I voted for, as a native Delawarean, I voted for Joe since I was legal to vote.
Senate, yeah.
Is there any message you would have for the president at this point?
That we love you and support you, and we welcome your homecoming when you're back to Delaware full-time.
Any message for the president?
Thank you. Thank you for what you've done. Thank you for reuniting us after a couple years of really tumultuous times. And yes, thank you. And I look forward to seeing you around town.
Stand by, guys. Call. This is my personal phone. What is it? 770? Nope.
All right, we want to go now to Chris Whipple. Get you back up, Chris. Sorry, we had an issue with Maya's feed. Do we have Chris? Okay, hey, Chris. Will you talk a little bit about what you heard from the voters there, that they were thankful that the president made this choice? From your experience, I mean, you've written a book about him. You've been, in the room having conversations with Biden, with his inner circle. What do you think some of those, behind the scenes conversations looked like that led to this moment that we're at today?
Well, it's a shock what's happened today, but it shouldn't really be a surprise in this sense. I mean, what I was told was that there were a couple of Biden family members who actually felt early on after the debate performance that they were a little bit wobbly about Biden going forward. They felt that they didn't want him to be hurt. They didn't want his legacy to be damaged. And I think it took a while, obviously, but Joe Biden ultimately came around to that point of view. And the interviews just now were fascinating. I mean, those are Joe Biden's people. He has a real connection to working class Democrats across the country. I was talking to one of his campaign staffers from 2020 who said, we always talk about FDR Democrats and Kennedy Democrats and never about Biden Democrats, but we should. He has an extraordinary connection to them, obviously a lot of goodwill. This was, I think, the most consequential presidency of my lifetime. When he came into office in January 2021, he faced an economy in free fall, a once-in-a-century pandemic, global warming as an existential threat, racial injustice, and oh, by the way, a year later, the Russians invaded the biggest democracy in Europe, and he's seen us through those things. So he deserves tremendous credit, and part of the calculation here, obviously, was not to ruin that legacy.
And will you talk a little bit about how you see this impacting swing state voters, undecided voters? I mean, we heard, as you said, those were the Joe Biden faithful. That's his base. And they say they're thankful for the decision that he made. They will support whoever steps in to run in his place. How do you think that moderates and undecided voters are going to take this news?
Well, I think it's a whole new ballgame, and it makes all of those moderate swing voters in the battleground states, they're now reachable. And unfortunately, until now, they really weren't, because the focus was so obsessively on whether Joe Biden could get up the steps of Air Force One or whether he would mangle the next sentence that came out of his mouth. That is now behind us. So that's a real plus, and I'm sure the the Trump campaign is scrambling, and they may act as though they didn't care whether Biden got out or not. But I think